Chapter I. The Age of Giants. Why the Titanic was built. In the first decade of the 20th century, the Nautic, the most commercial arena in the maritime world, the great shipping companies of Germany were an rivalry that had expressed itself in pricing, but in the physical dimensions of the ships themselves. Bigger, faster was luxurious. The compulsion. The company could claim superiority on all fronts, could also claim the most lucrative and prestigious passenger route in the world. The crossing between Europe and North America. The White Star Line, owned now to entrance, being by the American financier Morgan P.G. Peamlet International Mercantile Marine Company, faced a particular challenge from its principal rival, the Cunard Line. Cunard had just launched two ships of revolutionary speed, the Lusitania and the Mauritania, that were winning the Blue Riband, the informal prize for the hottest last Atlantic crossing. White Star's chairman, J. Ray Bruce Ismay, understood that competing Durant speed-ons probably not. His ships could not easily exceed the Cunarders in that dimension. Instead, Ismay proposed competing on a different taxes. Tirelessly, size, and luxury, the plan that emerged from me meeting Ismay and William and James Peary, the chairman of Harlers, and Wolf Shipbuilders in Belfast, was for three vessels of unprecedented scale. These ships, to be named Olympic, Titanic, Hannock, and Gigantic, later renamed Britannic, would the largest moving hands out of Milton Manors at approximately 46,000 gross tons each, and over 269 meters, and over 269, and is why they would every ship then afloat. Their internal fittings would offer a standard of luxury in first class that no ocean liner had previously, where enormous size would allow economic ease of scale in steerage that made eminent of fares. The construction of the Titanic began at Harland, Hoynd, Wiens Island Shipyard, Velth, in Marst, on March de Nards, Neeborn Theft, Words in Sirenive. 14 months at Olympic had been laid down. The shipyard, already the largest in the world, to build entirely new slipways of this size, gantries of unprecedented height were erected over the construction site. At its peak, the Titanic's approximately of funcarthus in nismerns that would be of a modern stances, by mauselmerns, falls, crushing injuries, and burns were common hazards so's of the riveters, platers, and fitters who assembled 4 million steel rivets by hand. Over the course of 2 years, the Titanic was slid into the water on May 31st, 1911, before a crowd of approximately 100 or 1,000 spectators. She was not yet a finished ship. The interior fitting out, which was the most labor-intensive and expensive was last a month's labor the construction would take another 10 months. But the launch demonstrated the sheer scale on a scale of what Harland and Wolff had built. And the Titanic and Thonic 5 phonemes, she displaced mammoth of water to the weight Woolius. In the Great Pyramid of Giza, she was, by any measure, a machine of extraordinary ambition. Chapter 2. A floating palace. The ship and her interior. The Titanic was not merely the largest past ship in the world. She was, in the ambition of her interior design and of her fittings, an attempt to create an luxurious is a value environment that money and craftsmanship could produce. Her first-class accommodations were designed not to resemble the interior of a sheer replicate, and in some ways exceed the finest hotels and country houses of Edwardian England. The effect was deliberate and striking. A passenger boarding the Titanic in first class was expected to forget that they were at sea. The first-class dining saloon on D-deck was the largest room aboard any ship afloat, and 32 dined simultaneously. It was paneled in ink in the Jacobean style, with alcoves and bay windows giving an atmosphere of intimacy. Despite the room's enormous size, above it, at the first clack at the restaurant, the Ritz restaurant, informally known, where passengers dine privately at individually reserved tables from a menu. Finland or Paris. The food served in these rooms was of a quality that reflected the White Star Line's genuine commitment to culinary excellence. Quail, lobster, grubs, and peaches and in chartreuse jelly appeared on the menus for the meal served on the night, April 14th. The first-class staterooms ranged from modest but well-appointed single cabins to parlor suites, each of which occupied space equivalent a generous apartment. These suites consisted of a sitting room, 2 bedrooms, bedrooms, a dressing room, private bath and lavatory, and a private promenade deck. N. Open-air space accessible. Only leets, occupants. The bedrooms were furnished in different historical styles. Louis Quinze, Louis XV, Louis Skinzi, Louis Seize, and Italian Renaissance, with reproduction period furniture, carved woodwork, and upholstery of silk and velvet. The private promenade decks, whipped with Wycliffe Gullit and could be enclosed glass screens in cold weather. The ship's public spaces extended to a swimming bath. The first on any ocean liner, a Turkish bath in the Moorish style, a gymnasium equipped with the latest exercise scenes machinery, including mechanical horses, a boulangerie court, and barbershop. The first-class lounge, styled in the manner of Versailles, contained a working fireplace, a detail that required elaborate engineering to implement on a steamship. Steel ship. The reading and writing room adjacent to the lounge was decorated in a Georgian style, with white painted panels, large windows overlooking the sea. The contrast between first class and the accommodable to third class. Steerage passengers was stark but not as extreme as is sometimes portrayed. The Titanic's third-class accommodations, while Maurice Barony comparing above them, were better than their earlier ships. Third-class passengers had access to a dining saloon with table service. A genuine improvement over the bucket arrangements of earlier emigrant ships. In sling accommodations, inns in enclosed coons of 2 to 6 berths, rather than the open dormitories that characterized transatlantic steerage a generation earlier. This was a commercial calculation as much as a humanitarian one. The large numbers of immigrants, the America, had third class, its thirds a significant revenue source, and White Star understood that basic decency attracted business. Chapter through the passengers, a cross-section of an age, the 2000. Who were aboard Titanic when she left Queenstown, Ireland, on April 11th, on April 12th, on April 11th. Presented a cross-section of Edwardian society was simultaneously typical of the transatlantic passenger trade and remarkable for the concentration of wealth, fame, and human ambition it contained. In first class were some of the most recognizable names in the English-speaking world. Of professionals, clergy, and skilled tradespeople of comfort placed them firmly in the expanding middle classes of the early early 20th century. In third class were the emigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the Raelian who were making consequential journey of their lives. First class on the Titanic's maiden voyage, what the newspapers of the day ascribe of extraordinary distinction. John Jacob Astor I.E. was at the time one of the wealthiest men in the United States. His fortune built on Manhattan real estate, and he was traveling with new wife Madeleine, who was 5 months pregnant. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining and smelting fortune, was aboard. Isidore Straus, who had built Macy's department store into a national institution along with his brother, was traveling. His wife Ida. Charles Hayes, the president of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, was returning from meetings in London. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife, Life Lucille, whose fashion house dressed the most fashionable in Britain and America, were also among the first class passengers. The White Star Line's own managing director, the Brainician May, was sailing on the maiden voyage, a status practice for senior company officials on inaugural crossings. Captain Edward John Smith, who commanded the Titanic, was the most senior in the White Star Line's service, had been to retire after this voyage. His presence on the Titanic's maiden voyage was itself a statement of the company's confidence in both the ship and the event. Among the second-class passengers were a group and scientists who had been attending a conference in Europe. Several musicians, a number of clergy, and the considerable proportions or prosperous ordinary families, making the crossing for business personal reasons. Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher, Dulwich College, was among them, and his top account of the disaster, published in 1912, is one of the most carefully observed eyewitness records of any maritime accident in history. The third-class passengers represent the face of the Titanic, has received the least sustained dozens of languages. From dozens of countries, dozens of languages. Many were young adults making their first international journey, traveling toward civic destinations. Relatives in New York, cousins in Chicago, obsoi, entry, na, contrary, they're still absorbing millions of immigrants per year. Their stories are harder to reconstruct than those of the famous first-class passengers because they left fewer written records, fewer photographs, and fewer affidavits. Documents, but their humanity was as complete and that of any passenger in first class, his class, and their losses were no less devastating to the families they left behind. Chapter IV. Southampton to the ice. The Titanic departed Southampton April 10th, 1912, at noon, beginning the voyage that would end 4 days later in the North Atlantic. The departure was not without incident. As the Titanic moved through the narrow channel of the rivet test, her displacement created a suction wave that snapped the mooring lines of the American liner New York, drawing the smaller ship toward the Titanic's hull and nearly causing a collision in Southampton Harbor before the voyage properly begun. Quick action, but the Titanic's officers and a dog tied averted the accident of the knit. But the near miss was noted by observers on shore and remembered vividly by those who survived the voyage's end. The Titanic stopped at Cherbourg, France, on the evening April 10th. Additional passengers, including many of the wealthiest first-class travelers who had made their own way to France to join the ship. Before proceeding to Queenstown in Southern Ireland, on April 11th, at Queenstown, the last passengers boarded and the last mail was loaded. People also disembarked at Queenstown, including a stoker named Jaffe who deserted the ship, hiding among the mail bags as they were taken ashore when the Titanic's anchor and set for New York. She carried some 224 souls and had but completed the last contact with land she would ever make. The first days of the crossing were calm and uneventful. The weather benign for early April in the North Atlantic, and the sea smooth. Passengers in all classes settled into the routines of shipboard life. Promenading on the decks, deck games, reading and reciting, and the social visiting that was one of the primary purposes of the first-class crossing. The Titanic's engines drove her at an average speed of approximately 22 knots. Not her maximum, but a respectable pace that Ismay, traveling in first class, reportedly encouraged Captain Smith as the crossing continued. Throughout April 13th and April 8th, Titanic raiders received multiple messagings from other ships in the area reporting ice. Specifically, a large field of sea ice, and numerous icebergs in the shipping lanes ahead. The practice of routing ice and well established, and the Titanic received at least 7 such warnings during the course of the day. Some of these warnings were passed in Smith and the navigating officers. Others were handled by the wireless operators Harold Brown Bride and Jack Phillips, primarily. Prelix Oakmirlis os messages. Passenger messages. One warning from the Masaba arrived at a particularly unfortunate moment and was never delivered. Bridge. Remaining in the wireless room, Captain Smith's response to the ice warnings was consistent with the standard practice of the North Atlantic shipping at that time. Reduce speed. The belief among experienced North Atlantic captains was that large liners moving normal speed, weather could spot icebergs, tank economic pressure, and that the economic pressure of maintaining schedule. The approach. This belief was about to be tested against the gouts. Night watch lookouts, working without binoculars and locked away, would have been locked away, and whose key could not be found. Scanning a Black Sea for an that presented almost no reflective surface. Chapter V. The ice. April 10th, 1912. Sunday, April 14th, 12. Was a day of exceptional calm on the North Atlantic. The temperature dropped steadily through the afternoon and evening, and a Titanic, as the tide moved westward into water cooled by the Labrador current carrying an ice south from the Arctic. By late evening, the air temperature had fallen near freezing, and this described as survivis maruth at a calm. Flat calm, with a surface like glass. The absence of swell wave and weather condition, it of a visible line of white water at the base of an iceberg, meant that the provided no natural warning system to supplement the visual lookout. The night of April 14th was also moon. The moon had set before midnight, not Rhea again before the accident, in the North Atlantic winter. The combination of a smooth sea, no moon, and no bioluminescence rent the visual range, the visual little ranged, that is compared to videos, compared to typical conditions. Lookouts, Frederick Fleet, Street, and cloned in the Kronhan foremast, would have been scanning a sea, woved dark beyond the immediate illumination of its navigation lights, straining their eyes, then offered not operas to, and no reference point, at approximately 11:39 p.m. Saw something dark against the dark horizon, and the shape resolved ethically into an iceberg directly in the ship's path. He immediately struck the crow's nest bell 3 times. The signal for an object ahead, and telephoned the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch, who was officer of the watch, Steve, Ed ahead, and immediately ordered the helm hard to starboard, and the engines stopped, then ordered the engines reversed. These orders were the correct emergency responses, given the options available. The question was whether there was enough time and distance for them to effect. There was not. The Titanic bow began swing to port, away from the iceberg. But the distance and speeds at grade were too great, and momentum and turning radius worked against the maneuver. The iceberg passed along the starboard, the bow. 40 p.m. collapsed to 15 seconds. To many people aboard, the sensation was of remarkably subtle, grinding. A shower of ice falling on the forward well deck. A shudder, the shudder that some passengers barely noticed and others slept through entirely. The iceberg, having delivered its fatal wound, drifted away into the darkness as astern. The iceberg had done was not a great torn through solid plating, as early accounts described, and as the popular imagination long assumed. Modern analysis, including the examination of hull sections recovered from the wreck site, has established the iceberg caused the buckling and separation of seams along a length of approximately 90 meters on the starboard side of the ship, from the forepeak through the first 5 watertight comp. The opening created was relatively modest in total area. Later estimates suggested perhaps 12 square feet of cumulative opening, but location and extent were catastrophic. Water began entering the forward compartments simultaneous, and the weight of the incoming water would inevitably push the bow downward until its boat emerged. The tiller bulged, the bulkheads that separate in bulks egg heads that separated the compartments. From one to the next. Chapter 5. The ship talks to her builders. Thomas, Thomas Andrews, and the arithmetic of doom. Thomas Andrews, the managing director of Harland and Wolff, and the man primarily responsible, Ponsell, for the design, was aboard as a passenger. Traveling as part of a team of company representatives. The maiden voyage, when Winton summoned to Bribs and Widnight and asked for his assessment of the ship's condition. Andrews carried out treatise a swathinch of the forward compartments with the ship's carpenter and the postal clerks, who were already skew from flooding holds. Andrews understood immediately what he was seeing. Had been designed to float, with any 2 of her 16 main watertight compartments flooded, and remain buoyant, and to remain buoyant with any combination of 4 compartments flooded. If those 4 were not at all at the forward end, what Carpenter's reports, his own visual inspection, confirmed was that water was entering at least 5 of the forward compartments simultaneously. This was the combination that the ship's theoret had not been designed to accommodate, using the ship's stabilities as understood as well as any man alive. The toothpick would found sink 1 to 2 hours. He was specific about this. Not that the ship might sink, or that sinking was a possibility to be guarded against, but that it would certainly sink, and that the time available was measured in hours rather than days or indefinitely. This assessment delivered a man who had designed and knew Italy's and limited's seasoned reprecision Prince nature than entirely. Captain Smith's response to Andrews's assessment was to the and oaths uncovered and the passengers mustered. The wireless operators were ordered to begin sending distress signals. Watertight doors, which had been closed automatically by the Collivision sensor, were confirmed shut. Everything that could be done within the framework of the ship's emergency systems was set in motion. But the framework itself was fatally, and everyone agreed. The arithmetic. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, 16 wooden lifeboats, and 4 collapsible canvas-sided boats, with a total capacity approximately 1,000 of 178 pp. 180 tided fallen 2 country toward 2 feet. 2 relowered. 424. Even if every lifeboat had been lowered fully loaded, more than 1,000 people would have to remain kingship. Kingship. The margin between lifeboat capacity and passenger complement was not a hidden flaw discovered in the crisis. It was a known Houston characteristic of the ship's design, entirely compliant. The Board of Trade regulations that governed British merching at the time, and indeed the Titanic, actually, than those regulations required. The regulations themselves were the problem, having last been substantially in a 94-inch stupid ninth. When the largest ships in service were roughly half the Titanic's size, chapter lit. Loading the boats. Hours and 40 minutes. The process of loading and launching Titanic's lifeboats, one of the Sin's classic histories in maritime history. And understanding it requires understanding the specific conditions under it occurred. The officers who supervised the loading operated it without adequate training for the specific task. There had been no full life drill with passengers on the maiden voyage. In darkness, in conditions of progressive confusion and of alarm, with a population of passengers who first hour, or more genuinely did not believe the ship was in serious danger. The first lifeboat loaded, broadside, 12:35 a.m. Flee an hour after the collision. Lifeboat 7 on the starboard side had been the first to be lowered at approximately 12:48 a.m., carrying an estimated 28 people is of it. Of 65. This pattern of lifeboats leavings significant capacity under capacity was repeated throughout the loading process, was perhaps the most consequential failure of the entire event. Had all 20 lifeboats been loaded to capacity, Sri Pratt 1000 and 1 through at 78 people could have been placed in them. In fact, the boats carried approximately 710. The reasons for the underloading were multiple and interactive. In the early stages, many pathfinders simply did not want to board the lifeboats. Standing on the deck of an enormous, brightly lit, apparently stable ship, and being invited to step into a small wooden boat suspended on ropes, drop to the dark. To the dark, freezing ocean was not an appealing proposition when the alternative seemed to be remaining on a ship. Were burning and band was playing. The early boats left under capacity because there were not enough passengers who could herd them in time. Different. Different officers loading different boats applied different standards about who could board. Some officers were reluctant to allow all men into the boats, while women and children remained on deck, punning men and children as an influence itself exclude rather there than a priority loading system. Other officers allowed men to board when more women could be found in the immediate vicinity. This inconsistency combined with the physical separation of the ship's decks meant that let's underloaded while all other areas of the ship still had women and who were unable to reach a lifeboat station. The situation in third class was particularly tragic and has been of historical investigation and controversy. Third-class passengers were located lowest and most forward sections of the ship, farthest from the boat deck, in the routes between their accommodation and the boat deck. In many cases physically restricted by gates and barriers that were part of the immigration regulations. Then in force, requiring separations from the rest of population. Many third-class passengers received the alarm. There seemed to learn as passengers found the way to the boat out decked or confusing and arrived at the lifeboat stations after the boats had already departed. The survival rates tell the story directly. First-class passengers survived 44%. Of second-class passengers survived, and approximately 25% of third-class passengers survived. Chapter through the bend. Human behavior in the final hours. Among the most enduring images of the Titanic disaster is that of the ship's orchestra eye on the deck as the ship sank. This image is not a romantic invention. It is historical fact, confirmed by multiple survivors. And it encapsulates something true about the human responses to the disaster, that among its most remarkable categorized aspects. The ship's musicians, 8 men led by the 33-year-old Wallace Hartley, began playing the lounge after the collision, apparently to prevent panic and maintain calm among the passengers who were gathering there. As the situation became clearer and passengers moved to the boat deck to muse, the muse moved with them and continued playing until the very end. The specific pieces they played in their final minutes are not established. Serm. With some recalling hymns and others recalling ragtime. But there is no doubt that they played continuously until the tilted too severely to continue. None of the musicians survived. Wallace, partless of a body was recovered, and his violin case was found strapped to his body. The behavior of Benjamin Guggenheim, according to his steward, represents another of the disasters defining. After being helped into a lifebelt and an emergency out, Guggenheim returned to his cabin, changed into suit and cabin, and reappeared on deck with his secretary, both of them in their finest clothes. He told his steward to inform his wife that he had done his best. Then his Nestons and their best, and were prepared to go down as gentlemen. This gesture, whatever one makes of its symbolism, was consistent with the code of conduct that many of the men's most prominent men seemed to embrace in the final hours. Isidore and Ida Strauss, perhaps the most personally affecting account of disaster's final hours. Ida Strauss refused to leave her husband's side. When offered a place in a lifeboat, she repeatedly said she had lived with Isidore for so many years. She would leave him now. The two were last seen sitting together in deck chair in the promenade deck, holding hands. Low water, the water. The years. Not all of the human behavior in these final hours was heroic or dignified, as honest historical account requires acknowledging. Skapaf and his wife escaped in lifeboat 1 with 12 other people in a boat designed to carry 40. After the Titanic sank, and the survivors in the water were heard screaming, and at least some of the 12 boat in lifeboat breastfeeders. They decided not to return, reportedly over fears that the boat would be swamped. Cosmo Duff Gordon subsequently gave each of the boat's crew members £5 a gesture his critics interpreted as payment for their silence, and that subjected him to sustained public condemnation at the subsequent of Trade Inquiry chapter. The wireless miracle ships in the night. The Titanic's distress signals sent in the new international call letters CQD and then in the newly adopted IBIDs. SOS were received at the ships in the area, and the story of how those ships responded a separate strand of the Zarpster's history, the Rangers from the heroic to controversial. The Carpentier, a Cunard liner under the command of Captain Arthur Henry Rostron was 58 miles southeast of the Titanic when the distress signal was Reeve 5 Whitelum at Cottam, Tot Quellum, ad 12:25 a.m. 25 a.m. Rostron was woken immediately and swift and decisive. He turned the Carpathia toward the Titanic's position, ordered the engines pushed to their maximum speed, approximately 14 knots faster than the ship had ever traveled, and began preparing for a rescue operation. He ordered all hot drinks and medical facilities ready. Verns, the lanterns strung over the site to light the ladder, and posted a lookout to watch for Fries. The Carpathia drove north-northwest through waters. He knew same ice field that had sunk Titanic. Buick. The Carpathia arrived at the Titanic's last position at approximately 4:04 a.m. Finding lifeboats scattered over a wide area of ocean and beginning the process of taking survivors aboard was commenced at 8:30 a.m. When the final count was made, Carpathia had rescued 710 people. Then Carpathia set Cork, arrived in the evening of April 18th amid scenes of extraordinary public emotion. The case of the Californian represents the most painful and uncontested element of the Titanic's wireless history. The Californian was a medium steams is needy sneed have steamed a 19 miles from the Titanic's. Though the exact distance has been disputed. The Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, been sending ice warnings throughout the day, including a warning to the ironing that the attacks off by the Titanic's wireless operator, Jax Illitz, who was busy with passenger traffic, and told Evans to get off the M. Evans went to bed at approximately 11:30 p.m. before the Titanic struck the iceberg, and the Californian was consequently without an operating wireless when the distress signals were sent. The Californian's office Ramos Dend fired in the distance at a proc that ten summit, ending at approximately 45 a.m. They alerted their captain, Stanley Lord, who was sleeping in the chart room. Lord asked questions, but did not rise to assess the situation himself, and no action to move towards Shet with and officers were watching. At the subsequent British inquiry, the conclusion that these rockets were the Titanic's Thus, that the distress signals that the Californian was close enough in times of rescuals of failures lies of rescue additional survivors and that Lord's failure to respond constituted this election of duty. Lord denied this interpretation for the rest of his life. And the precise distance between the two ships, and the identity of the ship, Alavorian observed, has met historian ever since. Ever since. Chapter X. The final descent. The last hour, by 2 a.m., with approximately 40 minutes remaining. Certainly steep. The ship's bow was deep in the water, and the stern was visible above the surface. The lights, powered by the ship's own generating plant, were still burning, and the generators would continue function, but forth to length to skill and when under testament to the skill and dedication of the engineering crew, the virtually none of whom survived. The last lifeboats had left or were departing. The maters and crew were making whatever choices were available to them. The precise sequence of events in the final minutes has been reconstructed from survivor testimony. And while some details remain unmained, or contested, outline is clear at approximately 2 TT. Collapsed. Flaps, fleeing into the sea and killing a number of people in the water. The ship, by this point, was in extreme distress. The steel of her hull was yielding to stresses not designed to withstand, and the sounds described by survivors. Great roaring crashes, tearing metal, the breaking of objects throughout the ship suggest a catastrophic failure of internal structure. The Titanic broke apart. The evidence for this, which was disputed for decades after the disaster, was eventually confirmed tentatively when the wreck was located, and examined in Win 5, 1985, and subsequently. The break occurred somewhere in the area of the third or fourth funnel, roughly the junction between the forward and after boiler sections, where the ship's structure was most prosperous and of defloating a Borıng forward section and the still buoyant stern. The two sections separated stinkno meritidum tungen voluntarily to sank. For those in the water, perhaps 1,500 people by the time the ship winter. That temperature, approximately -2 degrees Celsius, meant that the survival without rescue was measured in minutes rather than hours. Water this cold causes rapid incapacitation through cold shock. The involuntary gasping and rapid breathing in that can cause drowning within the first minute of immersion, followed by the loss of swimming ability within 10 to 15 minutes, as the muscles of the arms and legs are abed by coals, and then loss of consciousness as core body temperature falls. The screaming that survivors in the lifeboats and the warded warring from the water lasted approximately 20 minutes before it faded to silence. Loss Lilit. Lifeboat 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, returned to the area to rescue survivors from the water. Lowe had redistributed from messengers and his own boat among other nearby boats, then returned to Borıng. Very fala. The total number from the water by the Carpathia, and that the returning lifeboat was small, perhaps 6 individuals. The rest of those who had gone into the water. The Titanic sank at 2:00 a.m. on April 15, 1912, approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision. Chapter 6. The Carpathia and New York. The world learns. The Carpathia arrived in New York Harbor on the evening of Thursday, April 18th, having maintained wireless silence through much of the voyage from the disaster site. A decision by Captain Rostron that was intended to keep communications clear for official traffic, but that had the effect of creating an information vacuum that was filled in the days that the Carpathia was with confusion, false reports, and a period of uncertainties. The news of the Titanics had reached unevenly, and at first inaccurately. The first wire reports, based on incomplete other ships and shore stations, suggested had struck ice and was towed to port. That there had been damage but no loss of life. This comforting report circulated for several hours before the reality became unmistakable. The White Star Line's offices in New York and Southampton received information. The Carpathia that made the scale of the disaster clear to the court of Pinion, reached the Pinion, and Weck, and what a malice. When and how became itself a subject of subsequent criticism. When the Carpathia docked at Pier 54 in New York, with the Titanic's lifeboats stowed on her deck, the scene on the dock was extraordinary. approximately 1,000 people had gathered, along with reporters, photographers, and representatives of the major newspapers. The survivors came ashore into country in a state of, and their testimony provided in that began within hours of the Shapgang began to shape the public understanding of the disaster. The newspapers of April 16th, 17, and 18, 19, 12, and 18 aching across world to devote their entire front pages and many interior pages to the terrier pace to the Titanic story and the coverage that established many of the narrative elements that would define how the disaster was understood for subsequent generations. The heroism of the officers and crew, the courage of passengers who had remained calm and helped others into the boats, the third-class passengers who had been unable to reach the deck, and the specific stories of the famous dead. Astor, Guggenheim, Strauss were all fixed in the public mind within days of the sinking. The particular attention paid to J. Bruce's Bruce survival. He had a collapsible in a balloon for minutes, a loading, a letmon or looting. Allegedly, after no more women or children or visible in the immediate area reflected a public and press hunger for a villain, or at least figure, for whose survival seemed inconsistent. The demands of the occasion, Ismay was subjected to intense public criticism in both Britain and America, characterized in the American in particular in a particular. The cab and princes, then the captain is this speedy upset. To leave a sinking ship, the characterization was not entirely fair. Ismay was a passenger, but not an officer. But that it reflects the attribute the disaster's causes to individuals rather than to the systemic failures that a more dispassionate analysis would eventually identify. Chapter tours. The inquiries. What they found and what they missed. 2 formal investigations into the Titanic disaster, Borıng, and the weeks and months. A United States Senate inquiry chaired by Senator William Allen of Michigan, which began taking testimony in New York on April 19th. To one day after Carthy docked, and in British Board of Query, chaired by Lord Mersey, which began in May with a formal report. The American inquiry was conducted with remarkable speed and considerable drama. Senior Smith subpoenaed witnesses, including Ismay and the senior surviving officers, before though they could sail home, conduct the early hearings in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York and then in Washington. Smith was not a maritime expert. A basic unfamiliarity. No. Gave British witnesses and observers grounds for condescension, but his instincts about the important issues were sound. He focused on the quest of the speed, the numpacity of lifeboats, the ice warnings that had been received and handling, and the actions of the Californian, the American inquiry that concluded that due to the sanity of in an area where ice had been reported, the number of lifeboats was insufficient. The lifeboat drill had been inadequate. That better coordination of the loading might have resulted more lives saved. And that the Californian had seen the Titanic's distress rockets and had failed to respond in a manner consistent of the sea. Its recommendations included significant changes to life beams and ballarment. What's the requirements for rips at sea? The British inquiry, more technically sophisticated and more protective of maritime interests than its American counterpart. Lord Mersey's conclusions broadly rated the White Star Line from a Leglandland theme, deliberate negligence, attributing the disaster primarily to the established custom of the North Atlantic trade regarding speed in ice conditions. Essentially finding that Captain Smith had acted in accordance with the accepted practice of his time, even if that been beimdrit inadequate. The Californian was found to have failed in its duty, as the American inquiry had also found. The recommendations of the British inquiry also so focused on lifeboat requirements and ULIS regulations. What both inquiries partially missed, or underemphasized, or were the systemic stagnance, how an industry had arrived at a state in which a ship could carry over 2,000 people with lifeboat capacity for barely half of them in conditions where the regulations governing lifeboat carriage had not kept pace with the dramatic in ship size. And lifeboat capacity was therefore a secondary These systemic questions would eventually lead to the fundamental safety reforms. The same enacted the safety of life at safety of life of 1914. which established requirements that remain the foundation of maritime safety regulation to the present day. Chapter the Titanic revealed. The Titanic disaster occurred at a specific moment in the history of technology. A moment when human engineering alien ability had understeamed in of the limits and failure modes of what was being built. When the cultural confidence in industrial progress had created an environment in which the word unsinkable was applied. Tip ships, not as a marketing claim, but lead to believed the assertion. The specific design decisions that tributed Titanic's loss have been examined by naval architects and historians for more than a century. And while some conclusions remain contested, others are established beyond reasonable doubt. The height of the watertight bulkheads, which did not extend to the full hull height of the ship, but only was a key factor in the flooding and aggressive flooding. Once 5 pod compartments were open to the sea, had the bulkheads extended T-deck, and as would have been structurally on the ship possible, the ship might have floated in enough for rescue to reach her. The quality of the steel used in the Titanic's hull, particularly in the rivets used to fasten the hull plates, has been the subject of significant since from the fall. Since the recovery von hull seconds from the wreck site in the 1990s. In the 1990s, metallurgical analysis has found that the wrought iron rivets used in the bow section where the greatest damage occurred contained a higher than optimal level of slag inclusions, making them more brittle when with well-made rivets of the period, particularly in the cold-walled water temperatures of the north. Whether this material deficiency was the fixament's proximate cause of the hull failure or merely a contributing factor that would have occurred regardless remains. Regrows avlures the band among materials scientists. The absence of binoculars, the crow's nest lookouts, is one of the most stravialed factors. The binoculars that had been assigned to the crow's nest. A key that fitted the locker in which they were stored had been taken by an officer disembarked at Southampton and not been replaced. Whether binoculars would have provided enough additional range to avoid iceberg is the iceberg may have been invisible until it was too close regardless. But the absence of the binoculars reflects a broader inattention operational detail in the final preparations for the maiden voyage. Perhaps the most significant technological lesson of the Titanic was about wireless communications and their innovations. Safety systems. The wireless operators on both the Titanic, the Olimplorni were employee of the Marconi Company, not of the shipping company. And their primary commercial mission through messages. The system had no provision, dedicated specifications, no over commercial traffic. The reform of wireless regulation following the disaster, requiring 24-hour wireless watch on all large barge passenger ships, establishing international distress frequencies, creating the systems that would eventually evolve into modern maritime communications, represented a direct translation of the Titanic's lessons into regulatory change. Chapter Cars. The survivors. Afterward, the 710 paint who survived the Titanic disaster carried its weight with them for the rest of their lives in ways as varied as the individuals themselves. Some spoke about their experience frequently, becoming part of the public record of the disaster through testimony, memoirs, and interviews. Others rarely or never spoke about what they had and experienced. Some of the survivors became active advocates for maritime safety. Others simply tried, with varying degrees of success, to resume the lives that the night of verlopted of April 14th had interrupted. Lawrence Beasley, the science teacher from Dulwich College, and published his memoir within weeks of the disaster. His account is not believable. Let's go sleep on the Bermond. Writes like a man, genuinely trying to understand what happened rather than simply to escape. Experience. His book provided early researchers with one of the most eyewitness perspectives on the events of that night. Harold Bride, one of the two wireless operators, survived. They clung to an overturned collapsible boat. His account of the final hours in the wireless room, the message Phillips sent, the moment when Phillips sent below to attend other duties, and was never seen again. The chaos of the final minutes is one of the primary sources for the wireless communications aspect of the disaster. Bride suffered severe frostbite on his feet during his time in the water. and on the oak-tinned boat. He recovered, continued in a career as a wireless operator, and rarely spoke publicly about the disaster. Molly Brown, formerly Margaret Brown, Colorado mining Harriet, had been in first class, became one of the disaster's most celebrated survivors, partly through her own active public presence, and partly through the legend that accrued to her on Lifeboat 6. Encouraged the boat's occupants to row toward the area where others were in the water, and urged the boat's officer in charge to return for survivors. Advice that was not followed. Her subsequent advocacy for the survivors and her role in organizing relief efforts for those who had lost everything gave her a public prominence that eventually contributed to the legendary figure Figgy. She became the experience of surviving the Titanic while others did not. The specific guilt of having been in a lifeboat, while 15 hindered people died in the water nearby. Something that survivors described in very different terms, and that for some was clearly a lasting psychological burden. The complex emotions of survival, gratitude, grief, the specific anguish of having been separated from family members who did not survive, were not widely discussed in the public discourse, which tended to frame their experience in terms of courage and rescue, rather than psychological. The full human and cost of what the survivors is not easily captured in the historical record. Chapter Clavey, The Dead, Recovery and Remembrance. In the days following the Titanic's sinking, 4 ships were contracted by the White Star Line to search the disaster areas. The ships, the Mackay Bennett, the Menia, the Montmagny, and the Algerine recovered a trid of 3 revathered. From the sea, the others, more than 1,000 people, were never found, having, with ship, drifted from the area in the Atlantic currents, or been taken down by the weighting of their clothing in the cold water. The Mackay Bennett, a cable ship based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, was the Scotia's first to reach the scene and recovered 240 bodies, the largest number of any recovery vessel. Halifax became the primary point of arrival for the recovered dead, and Eddie's handling of the remains, the setting up of temporary morgues, the identification process, the decisions about which bodies would be returned to families and which buried lowly. became a significant administrative challenge conducted with considerable and sensitivity. The body of John of Astor, identified by the initials on his collar, was among those returned to families. Many of the recovered bodies were those of crew and third-class passengers and they were buried in 3 Halifax cemeteries, where their graves remain maintained. D. The process of identification was by the condition of many body after days in cold water and in some cases by the absence of identifying documents or personaments or personal effects on those who had come aboard with little. The physical circumstances of the wreckage, the scale of this area, the weather conditions, the limited facilities of the recovery vessels meant many big vessels but that many bodies recovered in the later days the search were too deteriorated to bring aboard and were committed to the sea with brief religious services. Memorial services were held in communities across North America and throughout the world. In the weeks the disaster, the scale of the public mourning reflected the degree to which the Titanic had already, in the days between her departure and her become a symbol of something larger than herself. Industrial ambition, of confident civilization's belief in its own mastery of nature. The shock of her loss was proportional to her confidence that existence had expressed. The public grief for her dead was consequently not merely grief for specific individuals, but a kind of cultural lamentation of human achievement. The graves of the Titanic's Stannard, splattered the graves of those who traveled aboard her. The Halifax cemeteries hold largest single concentration of Titanic burials. Specific victims were returned family England, Ireland, Sweden, Lebanon. Some bodies were buried at sea. When recovery impossible, the memorial to the disaster's engineers in Southampton reflects the particular tragedy of the engineering crew. All 36 of the 36 the engineers died, having stayed at their posts to maintain power to the ship's pumps until the very end. Chapter 13. The wreck, dug, and governed the ocean kept for 73 years. After the Titanic sinking, the wreck lay undisturbed on the floor of the North Atlantic at a depth a depth of approximately 800 meters. Below the surface, multiple searches for the wreck had been conducted without success, hampered by the limitations of searching of seismology. About the precursors of the sinking, the Titanic's had calculated their position from celestial observations Huns made hours before the collision, and the positioned mitigated in the distress signals was later determined. Furls mean from the actual sinking location on September 1, 19D. An American-French expedition by Dr. Robert Ballabert of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and Jean-Louis Michel of Ifremer located the Titanic wreck using a deep-sea remotely operated vehicle called Argo. The discovery was made at approximately 2 a.m. close to the time of the originating, when Argo's cameras moving across the seabed, it encountered a massive boiler growler lying on the floor of the ocean. The boiler's specific design matched the Titanic's boilers, and the sound, and they had to staunud fee on the ship. The initial survey of the revealed that the Titanic had indeed broken in two, as some survivors had insisted, and as others had denied. The bow section, about half a mile north of the stern section, having maintained structural integrity during the descent. During the descent, the stern section was far more extensively damaged, having torn apart by the stresses of the break, and the filled the spaces as it sank. Between the two main sections lay a debris containing thousands of objects, china, bottles, luggage, shoes, spread over an area of several square kilometers. Subsequent expeditions have recovered thousands and Titanic debris field and debris and their exhibition in new museums around the world. Glass has allowed millions of vast chips from the ship, a process that has been ethically controversial. The question of whether the Titanic site shade as a protected area, from which no artifacts should be removed, or as an archaeological resource from which artifacts can be legitimately recovered for study and display, has been debated for decades without a definite resolution. UNESCO has designated the wreck as a protected area under it. It's IRL unlimited Allen on the protection of the underwater cultural heritage and underwater cultural heritage. Ad various national legislative framework. Add layers of protection. continuously. Bacterial colonies, specifically the organism Halomonas discovered it in 2010 and named for the ship, are consuming the iron of the hull at a rate that eventually, perhaps within a generation or two, raise the remaining structure to a mound of rust. The famous bow section, where Svosabravchin first photographed in 1985, has changed significantly in the decades, and the most recent surveys suggest that the deterioration is accelerating. The ocean preserved first 333 before its discovery is inexorably its dissolution. Chapter: A Safety. The Titanic changed. The Titanic disaster changed ways that present day. To the present day, the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, Solus Spons of 914 of negotiated in direct response to the duster established requirements that every ship carry enough lifeboats for all persons aboard. Lifeboat drills be conducted regularly. That wireless communications be maintained around the clock on all passenger ships. And that a national patrol be established to monitor and report Atlantic. In the North Atlantic, the Ice Patrol, funded by the maritime nations and still operating today, has threaded the waters where the Titanic sank every year since 1914. And no ship has been lost to collision when an iceberg in the North Atlantic shipping lanes since the patrol was established. The broader cultural legacy of the Titanic is harder, no less real. The disaster occurred at a moment when the confidence of the industrial world in its own and mastery of nature, one of its peak. It's to its peak.
And
Titanic's loss punctured that confidence in the way that resonated the immediate event. The very symbol that the ship had embodied, the largest, most advanced, most else achievement, industrial civilization, became overnight a symbol of hubris and the limits of human control over the natural world. This reversal of meaning from emblem of progress to warning of overreach is one of the reasons the Titanic has never left the cultural consciousness of the modern world. The first decades after the disaster produced a quality of memoirs, novels, plays, and films based on the event. The 1943 German-Hun propaganda film, The Titanic, made the Second World War, and intended to demonstrate the reckless capitalism of British and American elites, was itself a strange cultural artifact. Its anti-capitalist message, delivered through a thoroughly romanticized telling of a story that transcended the ideological purposes to it put. The 1958 British film A Night I'll Remember, based on Walter Lord's meticulous 1955 both the same name, established a standard of factual accuracy and dramatic restraint in the retelling of the disaster that subsequent filmmakers either to aspire her or deliberately depart from. James Cameron's 1997 film at the time made it expensive film introduced the disaster to a new generation and remains the best known retelling of the event in any medium. Its combination of a fictional love story allied with historically grounded recreation of the ship and the disaster's events proved extraordinary, generating global box office receipts that for many years in history, the film's historical research was genuine. Cameron was personally involved in multiple expeditions to the wreck, and many tales of the ship's final hours that the film depicts are accurately reconstructed from survivor testimony and engineering analysis. The Titanic's capacity to generate new stories and new meanings not diminished with time. New books about the disaster are published every year. The survivors, the last of whom died in 2009, interviewed and re-interviewed for decades. The artifacts recovered from the wreck continue to be exhibited. The wreck itself attracts a tourism industry, deep-sea civil expeditions that bring wealthy visitors to view the ruins. An industry that was jolted in 2003 when the Ocean-Gate submersible CAD carrying five tourists and crew to the Titanic wreck imploded under the pressure of the deep ocean, killing all 5 aboard. This new tragedy at the site of the original ones. We have Titanic Totally story on store resonance. What Titanic oddly represents in the human story is perhaps simpler than the vast mythology has accumulated around it. It is the story of a society's conscience, as tested it against physical reality, and being founding. The ship was not built carelessly or designed by fools. The people who sailed her were not reckless or malicious. The systems that failed were systems that everyone involved in the bullet were adequate. The disaster happened because the combination of established practice, Risha, regulatory inertia, technological overconfidences, the specific stances, ignorance of its convents. They're a convent. In the clear April night, in the North Atlantic, created conditions in which everything that could go wrong did. And follow von did. 512 people died because of it. The Titanic asks the question that every subsequent industrial catastrophe. Chernobyl, the Challenger, Deepwater Horizon, has also asked, how do we build Stims law? Do we impod Simpsonisms confident enough to be genuinely, without building them large and confident enough to become catastrophically dangerous? We are still working on the answer.